Hello, everyone. How are you doing today? I'm sure that many of you were deeply upset to have to come down to the weather in Miami from all the cold Northeast and Midwestern places that you traveled from. Having come from Washington, D.C. myself, where the temperature was in the 20s, it was quite a pleasure to come home. And I'm just grateful for the chance to be together today. And truly, it's a treat to be able to come to a city that I will always call home. You know, Miami years ago welcomed my family, nearly 45 years ago, in fact, when we moved here. And my mother and father have been taking care of patients in their medical clinic for most of that time. They were, in fact, my original inspiration to go into medicine. My mother, in fact, is here. She came with me today. She's here in the front row. Back in 2015, when I spoke at the US Conference of Mayors shortly after becoming Surgeon General the first time, my mother and father came with me because it was in Miami as well. So they said, well, we'll come along as well. And to this day, the mayor still talked to me about meeting my mom and dad during that time. But it's truly an honor to have my mother here because my parents gave me everything that I have. They're the reason that I'm here. They're the reason that I have been able to do and participate in America, in my home country, the way I've been able to. And there are just some debts in life that you can never pay back, so you pay them forward. And the debts to your parents are one of those debts. So just an honor to have my mother here. And as Maribel mentioned, I'm a very proud graduate of our public school system here in Miami. And when my parents came here, we didn't have a whole lot of money. We didn't have the option of going to private schools. We depended on public schools, on public school teachers to care about us, to invest in us, to teach us and show us the way. And they did that for my sister and for me. And they gave me the foundation to go out and to ultimately pursue our dreams. And our family has really been blessed in so many ways to live the American dream. And when I look back at the opportunity I've had to serve as Surgeon General of the United States, I know that there are few places in the world where the grandson of a poor farmer from India could be asked by the president to look out for the health of the nation. That is the power and the promise of America, and I will always be grateful for it. It's up to us, though, all of us, to ensure that the doors of opportunity and the pathway to the American dream are open to everyone, and that the flame of hope and possibility that has always defined America continues to shine brightly throughout the world. That is not something we can take for granted. But as important as this is, we are gathering at a time when many of us are feeling quite worried and anxious about our country and the world. People are feeling battered and bruised by the crises and existential threats that we experience in our lives and that we constantly read about and hear about in the papers and on the news. This is not an easy time. The truth is, it hasn't been easy for years. In recent weeks, I've felt this myself in our children's school, where many parents in our school, people who have dedicated their lives to solving problems like hunger and violence and illness, have now lost their jobs and are trying to figure out how to pay for rent and childcare. I also know from many in this room who are in the media, but also for the rest of us too, that sometimes it's felt quite hard to stand up and tell the truth. Even though it's important, you open yourself up to attacks online and offline, and that's not easy. So I've been doing a lot of reflecting lately on my last 2 terms in government, and I've been asking myself, what have they taught me about how we got here? The thousands of people that I met in small towns and in big cities across our nation, they helped me understand more deeply what's been happening in our country. I remember the moms and dads who opened up to me about their children's depression and anxiety and how that made them feel like failures as parents. I remember sitting at tables with college students in Washington and Texas and North Carolina who confided in me that they struggle with loneliness and a sense that they don't matter in a social media world of constant comparison. I remember traveling to Uvalde, Texas after the mass shooting at Robb Elementary School and comforting families who are experiencing the unthinkable pain of losing a child. These conversations, and so many like them, they're etched into my memory and they're seared into my heart. They compelled me to launch campaigns to address issues from loneliness and parents' mental health to the impact of social media and the youth mental health crisis. They also inspired me to widen the lens through which our country sees health, making the case that it's not only our physical health that matters for our well-being, but also our mental health, our social health, and our spiritual health. I want to talk to you today about the central question that I've grappled with during my 2 terms. What is the deeper root cause of the unhappiness that I encounter so often? The truth is, the worry and unhappiness in our country is not all entirely explained by economic challenges or negative headlines, even though these are very important and continue to be extraordinarily important contributors for us to assess and understand. But after years of study and reflection and conversation, I've come to see that there are 3 essential elements that fuel our fulfillment and our well-being that have been missing in many people's lives. And these are relationships, service, and purpose. Relationships keep us grounded and bonded to each other. Service, from formal volunteering to small acts of kindness, is about helping each other. And purpose gives our life a sense of direction and meaning. Together, these elements form the triad of fulfillment. Each of these can significantly impact our physical and mental health, reducing our risk for heart disease, depression, anxiety, and premature death. They also allow us to connect to something bigger than ourselves, which is a universal human need and brings us perspective and support. Yet all 3 of these drivers of fulfillment have diminished in many of our lives. 1/3 of adults and about half of young people are struggling with loneliness right now. The majority of our country is not engaged in formal and informal service to each other. And a majority of young adults say that they have little or no sense of purpose or meaning in their life. Perhaps this is because so many of the messages coming at all of us tell us to prioritize a different triad, the triad of success, fame, wealth, and power. The hustle culture that we're in has us constantly chasing accomplishments and recognition and followers. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with these elements on their own, they rarely bring lasting fulfillment. So if we want to address the deeper roots of unhappiness, we need a clear and explicit shift that puts relationships, purpose, and service at the center of our lives. These 3 elements not only drive fulfillment, but they are the core pillars of community. And at its heart, I believe that this is actually what the American dream is really about. When Thomas Jefferson wrote about the pursuit of happiness as an inalienable right in the Declaration of Independence, he was not talking about achievement, wealth, fame, and focusing more on ourselves. To Jefferson, the pursuit of happiness was a virtuous pursuit that involved serving others and contributing to something greater than yourself. Jefferson knew that our destinies were deeply intertwined and that we needed each other. Shortly before I finished my 2nd term, I wrote a parting prescription to America to lay out a path to rebuilding community and re-anchoring our lives in the triad of fulfillment. On this path, it turns out it is the small steps that we take that create the opportunity to make the big cultural and policy shifts that are required. So let us consider, can we do one small thing each day to help someone? That is how we serve. Can we reach out to one friend each day to check on them? That is how we nurture relationships. Can we talk to our friends and our children more openly and honestly about how we find purpose that is rooted in contributing to the lives of others? When we take these steps, something extraordinary starts to happen. We start to feel more of a sense of meaning and belonging. And the more of us feel this way, the more likely we are to design workplaces that foster social connection, and schools that help our children build healthy relationships, because we recognize these are important. We are more likely to choose leaders who lead with kindness and generosity and service in their hearts, and support policies that reflect these values as well. Nearly 62 years ago, Martin Luther King Jr. stood at the foot of the Lincoln Memorial, not too far from where my wife and my children and I live today. And he stood there at the famous March on Washington and asked our country what kind of nation we wanted to be. That remains the question that confronts us today. What kind of nation do we want to be? Do we choose the status quo with increasing pain, isolation, and despair, with millions of people who feel they are on their own? Or do we choose to be a nation where we have each other's backs, where we recognize that human connection and community are our superpowers? Do we choose the path of health, happiness, and fulfillment? These are the defining questions that we are now called to answer. I want us to be a nation that leads with love and not fear, because to build community requires love. Love not as sentimentality, but as a commanding force with the power to build, strengthen, and heal. Love as generosity and kindness. Love as hope and grace. Love as courage. It was the late President Jimmy Carter who demonstrated through his own extraordinary life, his service, that it is in the people that we love and the people we serve that we will find our purpose and our joy. America and the world need a new generation of community builders, a generation defined not by age, but by spirit, by a fierce, unyielding commitment to each other, a generation that is willing to stand up and reject the pessimism and animosity of our time, and instead choose courage and hope. We must be that generation. It is up to all of us to build our lives around the time-tested triad of fulfillment, grounded in relationships, purpose, and service. It is up to us to rebuild community in America. My ask of all of you is to make community the lens through which you look at your life and your work, the compass you use to make decisions about what to prioritize, where you invest your time and attention, and what issues, organizations, and leaders you choose to support. How can your actions bring people together to help each other and build relationships? How can you use your role in sharing stories and shaping media narratives, in designing workplaces and schools, and influencing culture to create the experience of community for more people, and to make the case that community must be an urgent priority? I know this is easier said than done, but at a time when so many people are feeling divided and despondent, our work to build community could be one of the most important things we do to strengthen our nation. Whenever I start to lose sight of this, and I have my own moments of feeling worried and pessimistic, I think about the patients that I cared for in their final days, the people I was lucky to sit next to, whose hand I was lucky to hold as I listened to their stories, reflecting on what made for a fulfilling life. Well, it was never the size of their bank accounts, or the number of their followers, or their list of achievements that they talked about. They always talked about people, the people they loved, the people they served, the people whose lives they touched. You see, in the end, when only the most meaningful strands of life remain, this is what matters. As a father, I want to thank all of you for caring so deeply about creating a more compassionate, hopeful, and fulfilled nation for all of our children. This is the defining challenge of our time. And the most important qualities that we need to meet this moment are the ones that we've had within us all along. Our ability to care deeply about each other, to speak truth with courage, and to lead with love. I hope that we will never forget that it is good people with hearts full of love who have the power to change the world. Thank you.
Thank you, for those inspiring words to get us going this morning. I know that they are met with great appreciation in this audience and an enormous amount of resonance. We've been talking about community for 2 days. So many people here are devoted to strengthening their own communities through all manner of works. So thank you for that. Before we get started, and I know we'll have time for questions from the audience, so be thinking of what you want to ask the Surgeon General. But I thought I would actually start with a bit of trivia. Fun fact, if you will. You heard he's a proud product of Miami-Dade Public Schools, as am I. Palmetto, Coral Gables High School. We have something else in common, though. In 2022, Dr. Murthy and I were together inducted into the Miami-Dade Public Schools Hall of Fame. That's not the punchline. There was another person by the name of Armando Christian Pérez. Not related. You might better know him as Pitbull. So I like to think that the class of 2022 had some range. Oh, I always get a kick out of that, actually. Bringing us back to this conversation, you've spoken so eloquently for some time now, and certainly here this morning, about loneliness, and really loneliness as a public health crisis. We have a lot of folks in this audience who devoted their lives to helping to inform the public. Certainly journalists, certainly our civic leaders here in the room. What role do you feel that trusted information ecosystems play in individual and collective well-being in our communities?
Well, we all need to be able to get reliable information for any meaningful human interaction. If I'm in a, if I think about my relationship with my wife, like she needs to know facts and I need to know facts about what's happening in our day, what's happening in our family for us to have meaningful conversation with each other. And as obvious as that seems, it has become harder and harder for people to get basic facts, and that makes conversation harder. When conversation is hard, that makes building relationships difficult, and that's when you start to see community disintegrate. One of the things that I have worried about is our ability to dialogue with each other has dramatically diminished in recent years. And I do think part of this is attributable to how we dialogue now. We don't dialogue usually face-to-face. A lot of dialogue takes place online. A lot of it's anonymous. A lot of it's in the form of comments. And so I think if you went back in a time machine 30 years, I think, and showed people what the way that these online dialogues take place, they'd say that's not really a conversation.
Right.
That's not really people talking to each other. That's people talking at each other with completely different facts. And no wonder they're angry and yelling all the time, right? So I do think being able to have trusted sources for information is vital. Now, I think the problem that many of us saw during COVID in particular, but that had been building for years before that, is that trust in institutions has diminished over time, and institutions across a wide range of fields, including in public health and in medicine. And this is a real challenge for us. I tend to think, my own personal belief on this, is that I don't think it's that people just don't trust anyone anymore. But I think trust has flowed a lot more locally. And so you tend to trust the people you see and can touch and can hear from. So we found during COVID that a lot of people still trusted their doctor or the nurses in their community. They still trusted perhaps a local hospital. They trusted their pastor or their rabbi or their imam, right? The people who they knew, who contributed to their lives, they trusted the teachers at their kids' schools. But they didn't trust the people they couldn't see. And I think that creates both a challenge and opportunity for us to think, as institutions, whether in the media or public health, how do we actually build on-the-ground relationships with people? How do we create the visibility that's required so that a community member can see what that institution is, what impact it has on their life? That's actually how we build trust. And once you have trust, then people will listen to you. This is something I learned very early on in medical school from my mentors, who told me that it doesn't matter how smart you are, how many facts you have at your disposal, how good you are as a diagnostician.
That's right.
If your patient doesn't trust you, they're not going to listen to you.
That's right.
It's of no use.
Right.
And so building that trust back, I think, has to be one of the most important priorities for us in public health and media and really across society.
And it requires people to actually engage directly with one another.
Yes.
So let's talk about that, because we live in a world where we can't escape technology, and social media in so many ways is a misnomer, because it says social, but it's actually very anti-social, and we see how it creates greater isolation and sense of alienation. What could technology do to improve how we get together with one another and engage with one another?
Yeah. So I actually am a believer that technology can help us. I spent 7 years in a prior life, building a technology company to help with advancing clinical trials. Like, I'm a believer that tech can make our lives better. But I don't think it's a given that it always does. I think it's how it's designed and how it's used that make the distinction between whether it helps or harms us. I think when technology is used to actually bridge from online to offline connection, it can be very powerful. I think about the earliest uses of social media when I first got onto those platforms longer ago than I care to admit. But I remember finding old friends from grad school.
That's right.
And then meeting up with them in person, and then getting their phone number because we were now connected, and then calling them on the phone and talking to them. And we built these beautiful relationships with each other and sustained them, and that was wonderful. I think the other place that technology can be helpful actually is in bringing us together in smaller groups, not larger groups. And this is a bit counterintuitive, because everything online is often about scale, right? It's like how large a group can I build, how large a community can I create, et cetera. But we actually know just from the science of human relationships that people don't have 1,000 best friends, right? Like, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe very, very close friends. We have another circle of friends around us who we maybe get together with on weekends or for barbecues or go on vacation with or catch a movie with. And then we have a broader ring around that of people who might be part of a work community or a faith community or a volunteer community. And those 3 layers are actually called intimate connections, relational connections, and collective connections. But the intimate ones really, really matter. Having small groups of friends we can talk to really matter as well. And so I do think that paradoxically, social media technology in particular, has led us down a path where we value quantity over quality. And really what matters is quality. And what's happened is, over the last 2 decades, we have replaced confidants with contacts, right? Friends with followers. And I remember in those early days of social media, people getting really excited about, oh, I have this many followers, I have that many.
That's right.
And people are still excited about that today. But at the end of the day, like, when you have a crisis at 3 a.m., it's not your random follower on social media who's there for you. It's the confidant, the person you can call, the person who will not blink twice before saying, yeah, I'm going to come over right now and I'll be there for you. Let me know how I can help. That's what really matters. And technology can actually help us stay connected, bridge to offline, come together in smaller groups. I just think that we have not designed it in that way. And even though initially, ironically, social media used to be that in its earliest iterations, its current business model is one that's largely built on ad revenue, right? And that means that the more engagement, the more revenue. And more engagement means that you need more people. You need them to be spending as much time as possible on these platforms. And ironically, that takes away from in-person interaction.
You see this especially amongst our kids. You have kids, I have kids, and the idea of having them bridge from the online world. I've seen it in my kids growing up, having to shoo them back outside and away from just the video games, and they're having whole conversations with friends, but over screens and headsets or whatever. I'm sure I'll say the wrong things. What have you found to be effective? I mean, just thinking about your own family, what have you found to be effective in getting them to actually cross that bridge from the online world to the offline world?
Well, can I just say, as a fellow parent, this is one of the universal struggles that parents have. And just out of curiosity, how many of you have kids in your life and you haven't quite figured out how to manage technology, whether they're your kids, grandkids, nieces, nephews? Okay, just about everyone. It turns out when you look on studies that parents list technology and social media as the top 2 reasons why they believe parenting is so much harder now compared to a generation ago. And I heard this all the time as I travel around the country and talk to parents who are just like, I don't know what to do with this technology. Or they would say, well, if everyone is using it, does that mean it's okay for my child? And the average amount of use, by the way, of social media by adolescents today is 4.8 hours a day. That is just social media. It's not all screen time. It is just social media. So you add into that gaming and other forms of screen time, and you're spending a whole lot of time like on screens if you're a child growing up today. And the question that I often think about is, one, what is that screen time doing to you? But also, what are you not doing because you're spending that much time online? And what kids are not doing as much of is spending time in person with others, being outside, being physically active. It actually does compromise learning when kids cannot focus because they're constantly distracted. This has been a real challenge with social media in schools, for example. So this stuff really matters. Here are a few things that I have suggested to parents. And everything I'm going to share you are things that I've struggled with as a parent myself, but also solutions which are much easier to implement if we do them together. If we have small groups of parents who decide, hey, you know what, we're going to make a pact. We're going to do this together so we're not the only one, and our kid doesn't say to us, I'm literally the only one who has to restrict themselves in how they use tech. So here's what I would say. I'd say number one, with social media, I think waiting until after middle school to have your children start using social media is, I think, the prudent thing to do, because middle school is a time in early adolescence when kids' brains are uniquely sensitive to some of the harmful effects of social media. It's when we are much more prone to social comparison and social suggestion. It's when our impulse control has not developed as much. And then when you put a child, expose them to social media, which is designed to maximize how much time they're spending on it, which is as a culture of profound, constant comparison, which can shred their self-esteem, that is not a good recipe for someone in early adolescence. Now, if your child is already on social media, one of the things I recommend is to draw boundaries around the use of technology to protect critical aspects of their development. Those are specifically sleep and in-person interaction, learning and physical activity. So here's an example of what that would look like. You might say, okay, I want to protect my kid's sleep. And by the way, everything I'm telling you came from conversations with young people themselves and with their parents, right? Because I'll tell you that some of the people who have the most insight into the harms of social media on kids are actually kids themselves, right? And everywhere that I went, including right here at the University of Miami, when I was doing my national college campus tour, students would by themselves bring up the impact of technology on their mental health and well-being. So drawing boundaries around tech could look like saying, okay, when we get together for meals, we're all going to put our phones away, and we're just going to focus on each other. That could just be for 15 minutes, maybe it's for half an hour, but we're just going to give our full attention to each other. And by the way, that doesn't mean take your phone and put it face down on the table, because it turns out actually there are studies which show that when the phone is visible on the table, it still makes people feel like you're distracted when you're talking to them. So it has to be out of view. The other thing it can look like is saying, okay, in our house, we are going to put our technology away an hour before bedtime and charge our phones in the kitchen, right? And then we'll get the phones back in the morning. Now, this seems absolutely crazy, right? When you consider that most people sleep with their phones, and when they get up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom or drink some water, they'll pause, they'll look at their phone, maybe go through their email, right? And that shreds quality of sleep again and quantity of sleep. But the notion of actually getting a good night's sleep is much more rare than you would think, because our sleep is constantly being disturbed. But the data just keeps accruing to greater and greater levels. It tells us that sleep is vital for our overall physical health and mental health. And for kids in particular, given their sensitive stage of development, sleep disturbances and deprivation can increase their likelihood of experiencing mental health challenges. So these are some things that I recommend to parents, but most importantly, parents need to do this together. It's very hard to be the parent whose child comes to you and says, everybody else in class is on these apps and is using, is posting updates, and that's how people know what's going on, and I'm going to be left out and even more lonely if I'm not on it. Right? That's a very hard situation for a child to be in. But when you have other parents who are creating similar boundaries, or who might be waiting until later to actually have their children exposed to social media, that makes it a lot easier. There's a whole movement that is actually building in the country right now among parents to actually gather and build collectives to put these kind of rules in place, I think it's really helpful. And it was those conversations that not only inspired me to issue an advisory on parents' mental health and well-being, but also that ultimately inspired me to put out our first advisory on social media and youth mental health, because this is something that is really front of mind for parents and kids.
Absolutely. In fact, good takeaways there. I might have to try at least one of those myself. You mentioned the word community many times in your remarks, and we've talked so much about that also. Given your research, what can you share with us that you've learned are some of the key indicators of healthy community?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I will say from the outset that this challenge with building communities is not just an American challenge. This is a global challenge. When I was in UK, in India, in Japan, during my time as Surgeon General, when I was talking to students and others there, in many cases, you could have, if you'd blindfolded me and changed people's accents, I would have thought I was right here in America, talking to students at a high school in Lincoln, Nebraska, or in Boston, Massachusetts. These are shared challenges that we're having with the breakdown of dialogue and the breakdown of community. But a few things that I think are important for us to track. I think one, we now have validated scales to help us track and measure loneliness, right? That's an important one that we can do. The second thing is it's important for us also to understand, do we have a culture where people feel they have somebody to lean on in their life? One of the researchers at Harvard who conducted the longest running study, about relationships and mental health, he actually, one of the questions they asked in their survey is, do you have somebody that you can call at 3 a.m. if you have a crisis, right? And they were shocked by how often the answer was no, right? Including among many people who were married, right? And people assume, okay, if you're married, your spouse is the one who you can call, but many people were feeling alone in their marriages as well. So there's a couple of things we can think about. I think it's also important for us to ask, do people feel like they matter? This is a very simple question, but I will tell you how pained and struck I was by how many students, high school and college students around the country, would come up to me and say, I feel like I don't matter. I feel like I'm invisible. I feel like if I disappeared tomorrow, nobody would even care. Right? That's really heartbreaking to hear from anyone, but particularly from young people. So I think the simple answer to the question, do you feel like you matter, is important. So there are a number of questions like this that help us to assess the strength of someone's social connection, that help us also understand whether we are living in a network of service where people feel like they help each other but also can be helped by others. And finally, I think it's important for us to ask questions about purpose as well. When purpose is grounded in contributing to the lives of others, that is purpose that sustains a community, right? When purpose is solely directed at elevating ourselves, at enhancing our status, our power, our fame, our wealth, there's nothing, again, wrong with pursuing any of those things, but those aren't necessarily attributes that drive and strengthen community, right? And I would argue that in the long term, they actually on their own don't drive and strengthen the individual either. Because I can tell you that I know, and I suspect you know, Maribel, and many people in this room, know people in our lives who have all of those three elements of the triad of success that I mentioned earlier. They're famous, they're wealthy, and they're powerful, and they're profoundly unhappy, right? So we need to measure these three elements of relationships, purpose, and service that constitute the triad of fulfillment. And the good news is we have validated scales and ways to do that, but those, in my mind, are some of the most important attributes of community. And then finally, in the downstream, we can also measure the outcomes that come from that. Like we now know, for example, that communities that have a stronger amount of social connection, lower levels of loneliness, they have higher levels of economic prosperity. They have lower levels of crime. They're more resilient in the face of adversity, like hurricanes and tornadoes, right? And these are the kind of measurements we need to continue to do, because I do believe that the stronger our community is, the more benefits it will see, including when it comes to polarization and division.
So you're talking about a lot of the things that should be measured and that there are measurement tools to help us with. There's so many leaders in this room. We have mayors and we have heads of community foundations and publishers. What should they be advocating for in terms of often the solutions often lie in what are the programs and services and more specific tactical things that these folks could take back to their communities?
Yeah, so I would say that an old thing we learned, I remember early on in medicine, was that if you don't measure it, it doesn't matter. That's what they always used to tell us. And the corollary to that was if you don't measure it, you can't manage it, right? So if we want to be able to address these challenges, we can start with simple things like beginning with a survey on loneliness, right? There's a 3-question UCLA survey, which is used widely to track loneliness. It's easy to administer, it's quick, and it can just give you a baseline. I was talking to Mark, in fact, the mayor from San Jose, who you heard from earlier, about their efforts actually to measure topics like sort of related to loneliness and community in San Jose. So this is a simple place that we can start. And if you don't lead a city, it's not like you have to be a mayor to do this. We can do this in workplaces. We can do this in schools, right? We can do this in neighborhood community organizations to help us understand what is the baseline. And the other thing that we can do is we can start to build this into our suite of metrics, right? So when it comes to financial metrics, every organization pays attention to that, right? We need to know how much we're spending and how much we're bringing in, right? And we're used to collecting those types of metrics. But if we want to assess the social strength of our organization, recognizing that has impacts on productivity, retention, creativity in our workforce, that has an impact on academic achievement and outcomes among kids, then we should bake this into our repertoire of metrics that we collect on a regular basis, whether that's once a quarter, twice a year, annually. It should be part of that. And finally, what we should do with these metrics is we should make them readily available to people in the community, right? Because one of the things I have been just really struck by is like when you bring a community into a process, both into the problem and into brainstorming around the solution, they often have great ideas and insights that we may not have, sitting behind a desk. And if you make that data available, that can empower people in the community to target their resources, their ideas, at specific folks in the community who are most deeply affected. For example, most people are surprised to learn that young people have the highest rates of loneliness across the age spectrum. And people are surprised because they say, hey, well, young people are on tech all the time. They're like talking to each other. They seem to be texting constantly because they're not listening to me as their parent. Like they're just constantly connected, right? Why are they lonely? So that's one of the surprising things that you learn when you actually look at the data. And it turns out it has to do with what we talked about earlier, that it's about the quality of connections, not the quantity of connections. It's about the quality of time spent, not how much time you're spending in interaction with each other. And it's about whether you can really show up as yourself, be who you are, whether you know that you won't be judged for that, right, but in fact you'll be embraced. And that is what so many people are hungry for and find themselves living without today.
That's right. That access to the information and data is incredibly powerful, as you note. I have one final question. We're going to turn it over, so please have your questions ready. I often find that visualizing our aspirations really helps us to chart the path there. So 10 years from now, what does a really healthy America look like?
So I think about this through the lens of what I want my kids to inherit in terms of our country. I want my children and all of our children to be able to grow up in a country where people are optimistic, where they're clear-eyed about the challenges in front of them, but where they believe in their ability to come together and address those problems, where they're hopeful, they're optimistic, and they're courageous. I want my kids to grow up and to live in a country where people recognize each other's inherent value and worth, and they give them the benefit of the doubt. They don't judge them by their worst mistake or their worst moment. They don't cast them aside because they used the wrong word or because they forgot a fact. But they recognize that we're all human and we're all imperfect, but we still all have worth. I want my kids to live in a country where we also dream big. And we dream big and take on large challenges because we know we're not doing it alone. And one of the things that I think that drew my parents and generations of immigrants to America was the idea that in America we can do hard things, that we don't shy away from difficulty or adversity, but that we dream big and then we go out and we create it, right? But the corollary to that is we can only do that as a country if we are connected, if we are united, if we are strong as a community. right? And so I look at our ability to tackle big issues, whether it's economic inequality or climate change or conflict and violence, as challenges that require our collective strength and well-being. So this is, to me, what a healthy country looks like, what a strong community looks like. And finally, I'll just say that I think about schools, right? And about the fact that I want all of our children in school and out of school, to learn about purpose, to have explorations about what kind of purpose would feel meaningful to them, to learn the stories of people who have dedicated and contributed their efforts and their heart and their blood and sweat to improving the lives of others. I want them to see that as what they should be aiming for. Every time I encounter a student today who says, well, my goal is really to build my brand because I want to be an influencer, like there's a small part of me that dies inside. And I don't really blame the students for that, by the way.
Right.
They're responding to what they're seeing elevated in society around them, what they're seeing held up as a model of success. That, to me, though, that notion of a model of success that focuses more and more on what we can do for ourselves, that is not a formula for collective success, for a strong community or a strong country. But we have to be rooted in the idea that it is when we give back to others, when we go back to that Jeffersonian idea of the pursuit of happiness as being about being part of a cause bigger than ourselves, that's when we are living life to its fullest. That's when we are fulfilling our potential.
Thank you for that. I know some of you have questions. We have one right here. Great.
Hi there. Hi. Sorry. I just want to say I really admire you and admire what you're saying. I feel very compelled by it, especially as a young person. When I was 17, I'm 20 now, for reference. I'm still very much part of this whole Gen Z group that we're talking about. And when I was 17, I deleted all of my social media accounts because I was so obsessed with it. And still see everyone around me being very obsessed by it and overtaken with it, everything that you articulated so eloquently. And I find myself wondering time and again, what's gonna happen in the long term? Because to me, this is the troubling political issue for my generation because everyone is so sad and so obsessed with this. So is there going to be a day where people wake up and delete their accounts and say this is bad for me, this is bad for my friendships, this is bad for my sense of self and for the way I view the world and for who I want to be? Is that day going to come, or is there just going to be massive reform of social media to make it better so that people aren't so destroyed by it? What's the long-term solution going to be?
Well, let me just say thank you for that question, and be remiss if I didn't say that both of your stories that you shared earlier today as young journalists were just so deeply moving and inspiring, and I found myself just feeling lucky to be here, to be able to hear your accounts. And when people ask me where I find reasons to be optimistic about the future, I often tell them it's in the stories of young people like you, people who I've been privileged to meet all across the country, who are very clear-eyed about the big challenges that we face. They're not ignorant to that. They're not Pollyanna-ish about those challenges. But they are undeterred. And they want to make a difference, and they're committed to doing so. And that gives me hope. And on this front, your question of is that day going to come where we all turn it off? I will say the day has already come when many people are doing so. And I was lucky to meet some students, college students, who were part of the Log Off movement, which is a student-driven, student-led movement where students are helping other students come together and renegotiate their relationship with social media. And in some cases, they're taking complete breaks from it. In other cases, they're helping each other draw strong boundaries around it and use it in the ways that serve them and not in ways that don't. But I've actually met with, I think I mentioned earlier that every college campus I went to, students would talk about how social media was affecting them. So I actually asked some of the students who had taken a break, what did it feel like? Did you regret it? Did you feel horribly left out? Did you feel like all your friendships like diminished and disintegrated? Like what happened when you stopped using social media for a while? It's very interesting what they said. They said, for one, they felt jittery in the beginning, because when you're used to checking all the time, like you want to check all the time. And by the way, that's not just young people. I know everyone probably has felt that way with your phone. But what they said, interestingly, is after a few days, maybe a week or so, when those jitters go away, they start to feel like they were starting to live life on their terms, not on someone else's terms. They were starting to define themselves based on how they felt about themselves, not based on the comments of 1,000 other people and constantly comparing themselves to other people. They said that they knew less about what was happening, yes, to some degree on campus, but they found that the interactions that they had were higher quality and more fulfilling, and they were gathering more often with their friends in person. A lot of that sounds like a really good life to me, right? And many of these students felt good about it too. So I do think that that movement is building, but I think the more we write about it, the more we talk about it, the more we hold up the example of people like you and others in the Log Off movement and students, more broadly around the country who are taking these steps, the more we give people permission and encouragement to take those steps as well, because we have a collective action problem right now, right? Like no one wants to be the only one to not do this. But what's very interesting is I have a colleague who's a researcher in this space who said whenever he asks students, high school students, how many of you would be who want to give up using social media? A few hands go up. But then he says, how many of you would want to give up social media if you knew that if you did, other people would as well? And then all the hands go up, right? So this is a collective action challenge. So I do think we're getting there, but I do think that people in this room, in particular, including both of you, who are journalists, who can tell the story of what's happening, I think that can certainly help accelerate that trend. Because, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say this, I don't think that the help is coming quickly enough from Congress, right? Like the truth is that your generation should never, ever, ever, ever have been exposed to the kind of harms on social media that you have been. There should have been safety standards in place to protect kids. There should have been standards to protect kids from harmful content, from the addictive features that were intentionally built in to using the best, most cutting-edge neuroscience and the best product designers in the world with the intent of maximizing how much time an adolescent developing brain spends on it, right? There should have been safety measures in place to ensure that the moms and dads I encountered around the country who told me that when their child was struggling after a breakup or a major disappointment, that they started getting videos fed to them through the algorithm, encouraging them to harm themselves and take their own life, and then walking them through how they should do that. No parent, no child should ever have to go through that experience. Yet so many parents have come to me and told me that that is what their child experienced. Congress has a duty to protect kids with safety standards. And in my view, and I've met with members of Congress from both sides, there's bipartisan interest in taking these steps and establishing these kind of safety standards. But what I will tell you is what I have told them, both publicly and privately, which is the best of intentions don't help a child or a family who's still experiencing the harms. Congress has, to this point, failed to actually put in place those standards. And in doing so, in my view, they have failed at fulfilling our most sacred obligation in society, which is to take care of our children.
This is a very important conversation. We're going to take one more question. I have not wanted to wrap this up, even though I'm making our production team very jittery, ignoring all their cues to wrap up, because I think this is actually very, very important. Our final question from the back here.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Kate Carney. I'm with More in Common. We study polarization and division, and we're about to release a report that's really informed by your advisory on social connection across difference and finding that Americans do value social connection, and the biggest barrier is lack of opportunity. And what drives interest is actually seeing other people's value and experiences. So your point on norms is really important. But just wanted to get your take as much as you can talk on kind of, we are in a new administration, and your team and the advisory really helped elevate this issue, and if you think that there's any political kind of appetite for continuing the work that you started in, in your role.
Well, thank you so much for that. And look, the good news about the work on building community and connection is this really is actually very bipartisan work. It's perhaps one of the few remaining areas that has not been polarized, and politicized, perhaps, and I hope it remains that way. And many of the people that I met and encountered across the country, many of the senators and representatives I worked with in Washington, D.C. on these issues, they came from both parties because people realize fundamentally, at the end of the day, if we don't have community, then we don't have a whole lot in our lives. We don't have a foundation for fulfillment, health, and happiness. And the truth is, and this was I saw with the opioid epidemic when I was working on this during my first term, many people in our country, including many of our leaders from both parties, are themselves being affected by these issues of disconnection, loneliness, and lack of community. They're seeing it in their lives, they're seeing it affecting their families. I had one member of Congress who pulled me aside once and said, I know this is a really big deal for the country, it's an important issue, but is there anything you do to address loneliness in Congress? Because it's a huge issue here. And and he was actually right. I mean, you think, and what he described to me is he was like, look, you've got a bunch of people here who came from their hometowns. A lot of times they don't know people. They're scared to say or do anything because everyone's recording stuff all the time, so they can't be themselves. And it just isn't, there are not that many people they can be themselves with, and it feels kind of lonely, right? So some people that might sound like high school, right? And, and because a lot of students describe this to me too. They say, well, it just feels like you can't really say what you think because you don't know if you're going to offend somebody, is somebody going to post it and embarrass you later online. But I have great hope that this work absolutely can continue, should continue. And here's the good news, is it doesn't require politicians, in Washington, D.C. to lead that work. What it requires are community members, and faith leaders, educators, doctors and nurses, business leaders, moms and dads, neighbors, to come together and to make the building of community a priority. And what I really meant, what I said in the very beginning of this, our time together, which is it is the small steps that are actually the big steps, right? It's when we start to build relationships with our neighbors. It's when we, as my wife does so beautifully, bring the parents at our school together to talk about what we're going through, to just share meals together, to build fellowship. It's in those small steps that we actually build community, we build resilience, and we give people the ideas and inspiration to bring that community to their workplace, to other dimensions of their life. Look, finally, I'll just tell you this. I know our time is coming to a close today, and I often, I had the privilege of doing a lot of interviews with journalists when I was serving in office. And usually after the recorder was turned off and the cameras were shut down, there was a question I would ask them. And it was a very simple question born out of my own curiosity, but I would ask them, how are you managing with the constant onslaught of conflict, stress, and negativity that's coming at you? Right? Some of us may have the luxury of turning off our phones and putting social media away, but I know a lot of journalists tell me they don't feel like they have that luxury, that their job in some ways depends on being connected all the time, and even when they're off hours, so to speak, knowing what's going on in the world. That is extraordinarily stressful. And I worry a lot about journalists for that reason. I worry that they're humans like anyone else, people who need to protect and support and nourish their own mental health and well-being. And I think that has become harder and harder in a world where it feels like, one, you're constantly tethered to technology, but it also feels like there's always news happening somewhere, and somewhere, somehow, it's your job to cover it. So, I wish I had a magic solution for that, but I do think that if, as a country, we value truth tellers, if as a country we value journalism and free press, that we have to find a way to support the people who are making that possible, the journalists themselves, because if we don't do that, there is no hope for press being able to be the truth tellers and do the job that it requires. Fundamentally, I know that we are at a challenging moment, right now in our country's history. It's been building for years now, but when people look at the challenges in front of us, when they look at the polarization and division, it's easy to just want to crawl into bed, pull over the covers over your head, and just hope it all goes away. And I felt that way at times myself. I know that feeling. But I also know that it is in each other that we will find hope. That is in the small acts of generosity and kindness and compassion that we will remind each other that our true nature is actually not to be mean and dispirited. It's actually to pull each other closer to one another. And that doesn't always make the headlines, of the paper each day. It's not always what your editor would say should lead in the news. But it is the lifeblood of humanity. It's what keeps us going and what gives me hope. Because as I travel the country, that's what I saw. I saw in the most difficult moments after a major hurricane or in the throes of COVID, neighbors stepping up to make sure that their neighbor had food and that they were cared for. I saw moms and dads rush to the playground when a child fell down because they wanted to help that child even though that wasn't their own kid. I saw nurses and doctors putting their own lives at risk to help a patient with a contagious illness because they had sworn an oath to help and to heal. That is the true measure of who we are. And even though it may seem different when we go online, that is still who most of us are deep inside. And so our opportunity to see that, to evoke that from one another, comes from these small moments where we can connect with each other, where we can build community. So however you do that in your life when you leave here today, whether it's spending 15 minutes a day to reach out to someone you care about, whether it's spending a moment to help one person each day, even if it's just checking on someone at work who looks like they're having a tough time, I just want you to know that it's those moments that are the glue that ultimately hold us together, that create strong countries and a strong community. And so that's what our challenge is today, and our charge. It's to be community builders. And if we can do that, then I have great hope that we can build the world that I want for my kids, for all of your kids, a world full of compassion, full of love, full of kindness, a world that is strong, that is courageous, where we can do hard things, where we can dream big, because we know at the end of the day that we are together. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Murthy, thank you so much. Thank you.